Hey, how's it going, everyone? So today we're going to be reacting to Overlord Season 1 cut content, What Did the Anime Change? Episode 1, Yggdrasil and the New World by Annie News. Go ahead and jump into it.
As I've said before, Overlord as a series has quite a bit of depth to it.
Now, I really love this anime. I really, really love this anime. It's quickly shot up to my all-time top 10. And that's including the stuff I watched back in the 90s as a kid,
There's so much more to it than what we've seen in the anime. That doesn't mean the anime isn't good in its own way, but it does mean that there's a whole lot of lore and insight that we're missing out on. Excluded details with regards to the characters and the world that kind of change the way the story is depicted from light novel to anime.
Let's put it this way. Up until this anime came out, I thought the greatest anime that involved people being put into video games was Dot Hack. I know a lot of people thought it was Sword Art Online. I grew up with Dot Hack. I loved Dot Hack. So Sword Art Online was the next best, and then Log Horizon. But then this thing came. Overlord just shot past Dot Hack, and it's the one I grew up with.
So, with Season 4 right around the corner, I figured now would be a good time to finally go back and see how many of you would actually be interested in this. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get through all 3 seasons in time, but if you do want to see more, then be sure to leave a like and comment. That way I can gauge how often I want to mix this type of video in with my regular content. Now, before we get started...
I didn't realize he did stuff for Slime Diaries, or that time I was reincarnated as a slime. That's a good anime also.
This video is sponsored by Skillshare, one of the most extensive online learning communities currently available, with thousands of classes relating to numerous different creative topics.
We got a sponsorship.
Whether it be
right
taking
here.
the first
Not
steps to start your own
his.
business or learning new ways to hone your more artistic side, Skillshare has classes on just about anything. Personally, I've recently taken an interest in Twitch, so I've been looking at classes on what software to use as well as what types of bots to make. Of course, if you're more interested in learning about YouTube, then there's a whole bunch of different tutorials from some pretty big names on how to get started. So, regardless of whatever creative tool you're interested in, Skillshare definitely has classes that cover them. And since all of it's specifically curated for learning, not only will you never be bothered by ads, but there will always be a constant influx of even more premium classes, all of which you can gain access to for less than $10 a month with the annual subscription. That said, if you're one of the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description, then you'll be able to get a free trial of the premium membership starting today. So be sure to check that out if you're interested in learning new skills that can help in the future.
That's honestly a site that I would recommend also.
Now, let's get back to the video. Episode 1, The End and the Beginning, covering chapters 1 and 2 from Volume 1 of the light novel. In the near future of the early 2100s, the genre of games known as DMMORPGs have been made possible via what's called a neuro-nano interface. This is a highly complex intracranial nanocomputer network that allows the players to experience the world of the game as if it was their own reality, physical sensation included. Fast forward to the year 2126, and the game we know as Yggdrasil was released under the premise of being a sensory-based MMO. It was a new entry into the genre that would rise to the peak of popularity due to the immense level of...
So I do have a theory. Ein said that the game had been around, the introduction said that the game had been around for about 12 years, right? Now, World of Warcraft has been around a lot longer than that, and Final Fantasy XIV is very quickly approaching that. Same thing with RuneScape. RuneScape's been around a really long time, but none of those games are dead. This game is. Why did this game die? Think about the cash shop items. He's always talking about the cash shop. There you go.
Freedom that it gave to its players. How much freedom? Well, take something as fundamental as the class system, for example. In the game of Yggdrasil, there were over 2,000 different basic or advanced classes to choose from, each capable of being leveled up to a max of 15 levels. So, with the player level cap maxing out at 100, that meant that any player could possess at least 7 classes by the time they reached that limit. Of course, they could also possess 100 different classes each at level 1, but I'm sure you don't need me to tell you just how useless that build would be by the end of it. Now, aside from classes, players could also build their characters to have levels in one or multiple different races, of which there were 700 unique ones to choose from. To make things a little more simple though, These 700 were divided into the three main categories of humanoid, demi-human, and heteromorphic, each of which possessed their own positive and negative attributes. That being the case, it was clear that the purpose of such flexibility was to make it so that no two characters would ever be the same. I mean, with so many combinations of classes and races being available to pick and choose from, the number of permutations for them quite literally approached infinity. And even if two people did purposely build the same character, their appearance and weapons could be customized any way they want via the in-game creator toolkit. Pretty much everything and anything could be modified the way the player wanted it to be. As for the game itself, well, there were 9 different worlds that made up the entirety of Yggdrasil. One for each of the 9 realms of Norse mythology, and each expanding over an area that was 2 to 3 times larger than the city of Tokyo. This was the game in which many players like Satoru Suzuki fell in love with, and it's here that he was spending the game's final moments. Since the game's servers were shutting down after 12 long years now, Satoru had sent out an email to his 40 other guild members in hopes of one final reunion. But only 3 had actually ended up making an appearance. So, with nothing but free time...
That's something the anime didn't say. You only see the one guy show up. It's the, sludge-looking creature.
Time until the server shut down, Satoru began to reminisce on the former glory of how his guild used to be. As a group that had once ranked 9th out of all the guilds in the entire game, Einzel Gon was now just barely in the top 30. That wasn't bad considering there weren't really any active members anymore, but it certainly didn't compare to how it was when they were actually playing. The only reason they'd been able to maintain such a ranking at all, though, was mainly because of all the items his former guildmates had left behind. You see, gear in Yggdrasil was ranked by how much data it contained. The more data an item possessed, then the better of an item it was. So, many of the items Momonga personally owned, as well as the ones left behind by his fellow guild members, were, as you'd expect, the highest rank of Divine. That said, all of this was contained within the legendary place known as the Great Tomb of Nazarick. The reason I say legendary is because this was the location where the largest army in the game's history was completely annihilated. Back when Yggdrasil had thousands of guilds trying to make a name for themselves, a massive alliance of over 1,500 players and NPCs had attempted and failed to raid the headquarters of this top 10 guild. Part of what made it so difficult was the complex layout of each of the 10 underground levels. Floors 1 through 3 were parts of the grave.
Bro, they didn't even make it through the top. Well, in the anime, they didn't. They got crushed, like, as they were coming up to the front door.
4th was an underground lake, 5th a glacier, 6th a jungle, 7th a lava pit, 8th a forest, and the last 2 being part of this castle-like shrine. Another part was the allowance of what's known as guard NPCs. Because Einzel Gon was a guild that possessed a base larger than a castle, the game allowed them to create custom NPCs who could serve as a sort of defense mechanism. There was a limit to the number of levels that you could put into them, but many were made just for the sake of immersion anyway. Only a select few were actually designed in a way that intended for them to be capable in battle. For example, the 41 NPC maids that work within the Great Tomb of Nazarick are completely separate from the battle maids that defend the throne room. Each of the 41 were intricately designed from the custom drawings of the guild member Whitebrim. They certainly don't compare in strength to the battle maids, but they are special insertions from the maid-loving professional mangaka who made them.
I wonder what race they are, because they look human, but there's no humans in their kingdom as far as I know. Well, at this point in time.
Anyway, it's after confronting the maids that Momonga would walk through the room known as the Megaton. This is the large domed hall that stands right before the throne room. And although we've never actually seen it in the anime, the mobile game does give us a pretty accurate depiction. So, as you'd expect from a room named after a grimoire of demonology,
I didn't know there was a mobile game. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Along the curving walls are these alcoves that house their own golem-like statues. Each is made out of an ultra-rare magical metal and...
To be fair, I don't play mobile games because they're very heavily monetized. I'm guessing this one's going to be no different.
Each is modeled after a different description of Solomon's 72 demons. Then, embedded into the ceiling are these crystal-like lights that serve as the final line of defense before the throne room. At first glance, they do just seem like intricate adornments. But should anyone actually make it this far, then these crystals, which are actually monsters, would summon major elementals to cast wide-range area of effect magic attacks. If all 4 were to be summoned at the same time, then their combined power would be enough to wipe out at least 12 level 100s.
Oh, shit.
It was kind of like one last trap right before the true final bosses that awaited in the next room.
They didn't even make
Once
it through the
Momonga
front.
had got there himself, he was surprised to see that Albedo was carrying the world item Gnenagap. Normally, these extremely rare and overpowered items were kept in the treasury. But the fact that this one was here in the hands of this NPC meant that her creator had come and given it to her. If you're wondering just how rare and overpowered these items are, well, only 200 exist in the entire game, and a good number are said to possess literal game-breaking and rule-bending abilities. I mean, some are even capable of getting the admins to change the very fundamentals of the game's system. So, to come into possession of even a single world item was actually one of the most prestigious feats to accomplish while playing. For Momonga's guild in particular, his possessed most out of all the others. Their collection of 11 completely dwarfed the next closest guild's collection of only 3. Years of hard work had allowed them to put together one of the rarest treasuries in the game. That's why
Only 11 out of 43 members.
all of it was kept locked behind a highly secure vault guarded by the 37 golems known as the Yggdrasil. Now, with that being most of the details regarding the game world of it.
And man, if you think about it, for Final Fantasy, that would be enough for a static with a few reserves, and that's it. Because you need 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah, you got 3 reserves.
We can now focus on more of the actual plot elements that didn't make it into the anime, of which there's actually quite a bit more than what we're used to with shows like ReZero or Shield Hero. You see, the Overlord anime tends to simplify the story in a way that somewhat changes the narrative of the light novel. What I mean is that there are numerous times when the light novel would deliberately present events out of order in order to enhance the overall suspense and mystery. When it comes to the anime, though, every event is presented chronologically.
Dude, I didn't notice that. I really wish they would have went with the mystery.
Occasionally resulting in some of that mystery and suspense to be completely removed, but most often leading to a lack of development for the side characters and world building. So, with all that said, the first large portion cut was the introduction of Carne Village. Right after Ainz had been isekai'd to the New World, the story had shifted itself to the perspective of Enri, giving us a brief glimpse into what her life was like before the raid of her village. The village itself was described to be a small settlement of only 120 people, a remote residential area located just
That's smaller than where I live, and I live in a very small area. The population is only 1,000. That's why up until like 10 years ago, the only internet we could get was DSL, and before that, it was just straight up AOL dial-up.
south of the mountainous border between the Empire and the Kingdom. Due to its proximity to the forest, Carne was in a prime position to take advantage of all its resources. So, the typical day for Enri and many others usually consisted of doing whatever basic agricultural work was needed. It was an uneventful life in which Enri thought would continue forever. A life that, as we know, changed on a day that started just like any other. While she was out early in the morning getting water like how she usually did, that standard routine was quickly shattered when screams could be heard coming from the distance. Her natural reaction was of course to rush back to the village, but the only thing that awaited her was death and destruction. Once she finally got there, all she could see was many of the people she knew like family being cut down in front of her. It was a horrifying sight that made her run straight back home to see if she could find her own family. Luckily for her, all were safe as they had been waiting inside specifically so that Enri could find them. They didn't want her to have to return to an empty house alone. While that did allow them to be together one more time, it was that very hesitation to leave that made it impossible to escape now. The opportunity to flee was no longer available. That's why when we finally get to this part in episode 3, all we see is Enri's mother and father doing what they can to buy time for her. That was what we missed from Enri's perspective. It wasn't necessarily a very important element to the overall story, but it does showcase how Enri partially feels at fault for the death of her parents. There was a certain feeling of guilt that made her reluctant to leave them behind. Only after looking back to see the shaking head of her mother did Enri understand that she now had to survive for the sake of her sister. Switching back to the moments after the server shut down, it was Momonga's experiment with Albedo that gave us a bit of insight into how he's able to control his power. We didn't get anything entirely specific, but apparently using any of his various abilities was now as natural.
Now, as good as this show is, it is very sad in some ways. It's horrible in a lot of ways, but it is so amazing. Its narrative is just, if it wasn't for those horrible or evil or whatever things, the show would not be what it is. You need a good villain. There's a reason why people love the Joker. Batman, he's cool, but he wouldn't be Batman without the Joker. Like, Detective Comics really took off after the Joker.
As it was to breathe. This was determined after realizing that Albedo's odd reaction to his touch was due to the damaging effects of his Elderlich passive negative touch. As soon as he realized that this ability was active, the details on how to use it, along with everything else, just completely...
Oh, I didn't even get to the point of that. The main thing is that you really do need good villains. And a good villain is a good villain. Like, they have to be villainous. They can't just... I mean, I say you need a good villain, but then there are stories where you have the villain kind of like... oh, what is that? It's a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, I think. It might not be Sleeping Beauty. I've been trying to think of which one it is, but I can't really place it. Anyway, Angelina Jolie plays, I think it might have been Snow White. I don't know. Angelina Jolie, no, it wasn't Snow White. Which is the one with the dragon? Maleficent. Angelina Jolie played Maleficent in Maleficent. That's why I couldn't think of the name. It's because it's not named after the original. It's her name instead. So it's kind of like Maleficent. She was a good villain, but at the same time, she was a villain that you could, feel for and even come to love. But that's an example of a good way to do that. But then you also need those pure evil ones, like the Joker or Voldemort. Just a really good villain. They're needed for the story.
It dawned on him. So it's pretty safe to assume that Momonga is completely proficient with every aspect of his level 100 Overlord build. Now, one aspect of it that was only briefly shown was the presence of the 9 rings that he wears on each of his fingers. Normally it was only possible to wear 1 ring per hand, but because Yggdrasil was a very pay-to-win type game, an expensive cash shop item allowed for 10 rings to be worn and used all at the same time. It was an essential item to have for any player who prioritized their strength. As for the Ring of Einzulgon, well, this was a very crucial item for traversing Nazarick. Not only did it enable instant teleportation to any named room within the entire tomb, but it was also the only way to get into the treasury. Any other teleportation magic was completely blocked by the tomb's defenses. So, without that ring, a whole bunch of areas would become completely inaccessible. In any case, the place Momonga teleported to first was the area known as the Amphitheater, an identical replica of the Roman...
I actually really love this floor because the sky. I know when he goes outside, the sky is more, beautiful. But just having this inside, man, this would be my sleeping quarters.
Colosseum. What's interesting to note about it is that this was where every intruder to ever enter Nazarick would be taken. It was here that those foolish enough to enter the tomb would be slaughtered as entertainment. And it was here that no one aside from the 1,500-man raid had ever made it past. When that memory had crossed his mind, Momonga began to recall how the raid was a battle that Aura and Mare had died in. It made him wonder if death was something that those two could even remember. You see, dying wasn't really the end-all be-all. When it came to Yggdrasil, players who died simply lost 5 levels and a single inventory item. NPCs, on the other hand, could be revived with no penalty and a little bit of money. So, considering that XP...
Bro, do you get to choose which item you lose? Because it would... Hello? Yeah. Do you get to choose which item you lose? Because if not, it would really, really suck, because you might accidentally just lose one of those world items. Just get it deleted. I'm sure those would be protected.
safety wasn't the hardest thing to obtain, dying had become more of a means to respec certain aspects of a player's build. It was an intended part of the game in which players could explore more diverse builds rather than be stuck with what they've already committed to. The reason this
I like
concept was
that.
so intriguing to Ainz, though, was mainly because he wasn't sure if Aura and Mari had come back as the same people they were before. Perhaps death functioned a little bit differently between players and NPCs. Perhaps every time an NPC came back, they were a completely new existence. Although this was a question that Ainz really wanted an answer to, he certainly wasn't going to ask them about it now. Right now, the priority was to simply gather information, specifically with regards to his abilities, as well as to see if any NPCs were actually hostile to him. So, while Momonga was doing some experimentation with the staff of Ainz Ulgon, the story switches yet again now to the perspective of Gazif. It's here that the power struggle within the Riestes kingdom is first established, a topic that's really only very briefly touched upon in the anime. Normally this wouldn't be that big of a deal, but to downplay the importance of these seemingly significant matters would result in the omission of one of the most enjoyable aspects of Overlord. The aspect of how Ainz's involvement tends to just completely diminish the significance of everything else. I'm sure you've been able to realize this after 3 seasons of content, but the more effort that's put into establishing these supposedly plot-centric characters or events, the more entertaining it is when Ainz just comes in and makes it all seem pointless.
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
with all that said, the power struggle of the kingdom was one in which the nobles were orchestrating. Their plan was to use the raided villages as an excuse to send out Gazif undermanned. They hoped to be able to place him in a situation where he'd be unable to protect the villagers. If the king's so-called strongest soldier couldn't even protect a single village, then that would lay the foundation for an internal conflict. The nobles could begin to question the king's very competence. They could start taking the first steps towards getting him removed from the throne. Of course, Gazif knew all too well that this was what was happening, but he wasn't about to abandon the lives of people that could be saved. Now, switching back to Momonga, there was a secondary reason behind why he wanted to showcase his abilities in the amphitheater, and that was to demonstrate to a couple of NPCs just how foolish it would be to oppose him. You see, Momonga still wasn't sure just how loyal all these NPCs would actually be to him. There was a certain
They're
loophole
pretty
regarding their
damn
behavior
loyal.
that he was extremely concerned about. What this was that if these NPCs truly acted in accordance with the details of their bio like how he thought, then it was only a matter of time before they would eventually come across a situation in which their bios wouldn't have prepared them for. Plus, if none of their bios mentioned anything about being loyal to him specifically, then that would mean that their willingness to follow orders would be completely up to their own individual discretion. That was a notion that Momonga knew he
I'm
couldn't
sure
simply disregard.
his guild members
Even if all the
had
NPCs
foresight on that.
displayed unyielding
Maybe
loyalty
not.
right now, there was no guarantee that that loyalty would remain in the future. So, to blindly trust them as they were now was nothing short of utter foolishness. That's why such precaution was needed along with this display of power. What Momonga was sure of, though, was that this new world certainly wasn't the same as the Yggdrasil he was used to. He was also certain that the NPCs were conscious beings just like humans now. They did seem to be based off their data from Yggdrasil, but their emotions were far too complex to indicate that they were being emulated by code. That being the case, Momonga felt he needed to act in a manner befitting someone who could lead them. So that's exactly what he was planning to do. Anyway, that's pretty much it for episode 1. I'm not entirely sure when I'll do the next episode, but if you want to see more, then be sure to leave a like and a comment. My main focus for the season is going to be mostly Tensida, but if this video does do fairly well, then I'll try to make this type of content a bit more frequently. Now, before I go, I do want to mention that I've started streaming a little bit over at Twitch. So, if you want to come and chat while I play a bunch of different video games, then you can follow me at the Twitch link down below.
Go ahead and follow him, you know?
Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do.
This was a really good video. I like hearing about the stuff that I missed in the anime, or the stuff that was not in the anime. One of these days, I may buy the light novel, maybe even the web novel. But for now, that's not the plan. I really, really love the anime, though. So I'm probably going to end up buying the web novel and light novel. If you do like this video, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.